your thought actually impacts on your physical well-being. So if you're sitting there thinking, I'm ill, I'm dying, I'm ill, I'm going to have a heart attack, and you're thinking negative thoughts, that can actually be measured as having an impact on your body. And if you keep thinking that negativity, it will then impact. On the contrary, if you can train your mind to think in a positive way, God, it's amazing, I'm alive, I'm a human being, I've got all these potentials I can do with my life. I'm in the middle of France, it's beautiful here, I've got friends sort of scattered all over the world. I love knowledge. What's not to love about life? If you think positively, then you're not going to, contract sort of, your system won't start shutting down physically. And by the way, we use the term a physician to mean a healer, a doctor, someone that cares for you physically, looks after you. And there's a strong link between philosophy and healing. I've always said, as Pythagoras did, that the purpose of philosophy is to heal, but at a deeper level than just, sadly, physicians now, you go and see them, they give you a pill and send you away. That's not proper physicians. A true physician would be concerned for what you're thinking and you're feeling and how you are in yourself, So anyway, that's physics and IT, which is absolutely extraordinary, and I love it. But I don't think it's the full answer. I don't think it explains in itself. I mean, even though AI is amazing, and we've now got these new things coming on stream, Chat PG or whatever it's called, which can, rewrite the Bible in the philosophy of Thomas Daffern, blip, and it'll rewrite the whole thing. I mean, it seems to me it's cheating. I think if we're not careful, we're going to make our thinking redundant. I think it's important that we think as well. These computers, they can mimic thought, and if we program them to be very sophisticated, they can translate Thomas's lectures into Chinese, in 10 minutes, and fine, that's good. But I don't think we should make them so sneaky that they can take words out of our mouths, or that'd be silly. Okay, the second one to look at, comparing and contrasting, is number 147, which is what's called analytical philosophy. There's probably about 2 million practitioners of this, and it's called analytical or logical philosophy. And this was very much the vogue in Oxford when I was studying as a philosopher, sometimes called the Oxford School. And I have a kind of love-hate relationship with analytical philosophy. I mean, I love it, but I also think it's got limitations. It goes right back to the beginning, to Parmenides, who was a great Greek philosopher, who wanted to analyse what is being, and did so very complicated and logically. What is existence, And he came to the conclusion, well, everything is existence. There's nothing that isn't existence. It is the one. It is being itself. And it takes the form now of a candle, now of a pen, now of a person, now of a light, now of a sound. But it's all being. And he presented a sort of logical proof that everything is isness. And that was his philosophy. Including the gods. He was a devotee of Apollo. And he was in a lineage of priest kings that were like shamans. A great man. He went to Athens and he met Socrates. And Socrates was another analytical philosopher. So whenever you said to Socrates something like, "What time is it, Socrates?" I mean, they didn't have watches, but they had water clocks. "What time is it, Socrates?" He'd say, depends what you mean by time. Do you mean the time we know when we're awake, or do you mean the time when we're dreaming, or and it depends what you mean by is. What time is it? I mean, do you mean at the time you're asking the question, or do you mean now, which is already a couple of seconds later? Can I actually therefore ever say what time it is? Because the minute I start saying it, it won't be that time anymore. And so on and so on. Reading Socrates is a bit like having a kind of a lesson in logical thinking. And Socrates was always, I think, using logic to show its limitations. If you got into a discussion with Socrates about justice or truth or love, whatever you said, he'd disprove it, because logically it won't stand. And therefore, where you get to with Socrates is always that, well, it's got to be something else then, that we don't know how to think that yet. And so it brought humility. That's why Socrates always said he didn't know anything, because his intelligence was such that he could see through all the arguments about everything. And that left him just in a state of wonder and amazement at existence. Now that's analytical philosophy at a high degree. Plato also, in his dialogues, used analytical thought to analyse, reality, particularly, through the medium of recording the discourses that Socrates had in his circle, and they were always profound discussions, and each dialogue is about a different theme. The symposium is about love. So they're sitting around discussing in Athens what is the nature of love, logically trying to work it out. It's a masterpiece. It's still one of the great bits of literature in the world. And I'm listening to it at the moment in my spare time as a talking book. I'm determined to re-listen to all the works of Plato in my spare time over the next month or two. It was also going on in China with Confucius. He was an analytical thinker. He was, as we saw when we looked at Confucian thought, he was trying to understand virtue and knowledge and, righteousness, to use a Western term. What is the right thing to do in any given situation? Well, let's analyse it. He was using intellect in that way. So was Aristotle in his own way, very much so, trying to analyse, different virtues. I mean, the Russian army is showing great courage in attacking Ukraine. I mean, Putin was quite brave to do that. So he's showing a bit of virtue, a bit of courage. But at the same time, he's committing war crimes, he's capturing the children of Ukraine, he's destroying buildings and cities, and he's committing, his troops have been committing human rights abuse and torture, and so that's definitely not a virtue, that's the opposite, those are vices. And so Aristotle would say, well, let's weigh these up. Yeah, not a good idea, shouldn't have invaded, it's a bad thing. Bad boy, go to the bottom of the class of the cosmic, lessons. And so Aristotle was always trying to analyse our lives for their ethical virtue, and trying to analyse the terms through which we think. In Buddhism, Gautama Buddha was doing the same thing over in northern India, and there's a whole logical school of Buddhism. The Buddhists decided that everything is made of emptiness. They jumped to the field pretty early on. It's shunyata, which is the field of emptiness. And the things that exist are what they call dharmas, but they only exist briefly, where all of us are impermanent. Every form that exists, even this entire planet, is impermanent. It won't last forever. So what is permanent? Is there anything? Yes, consciousness, Buddha nature, enlightenment. That is the closest you can get to the pure field. That is immortal and eternal. That will remain. And the purer your thoughts, the more enlightened your thoughts, the more compassionate they are. The more you think loving, compassionate thoughts for everybody, the more close you are to the field of enlightenment. So that's, the Buddhists have worked that out. And they use logic to, a bit like Socrates, sort of disprove logic. You can't describe that purely logically. You have to make a leap into experience. You have to actually experience that void of shunyata, which they do through meditation. And their great teacher of logic was called Nagarjuna, who was, he invented this wonderful logic system called neti neti, which is not this, not that. So you start with the proposition, God is one, let's say the monotheistic thing, there's only one God, God is one. Okay, well, which one? Like there are several monotheistic traditions going around saying God is our one. Well, which one is it? So that one, that's a not. That's not going to work, that one. Well, maybe God isn't one. Go to the opposite argument. Well, but then there wouldn't be a God, there'd be nothing. And how come there are so many gods and people are worshipping them? And right now in temples all over the world, they're praying to their one God, or their many gods. Like, do we have to tell them all they're wrong, they're all crazy, make it illegal? Maybe there's some part truth in all that. So anyway, nobody, at the point of Nagarjuna's teaching, is that nobody has the absolute handle on exact truth. When Pilate asked Christ what is truth, Christ didn't reply. Now there's many different interpretations of why he didn't reply. My interpretation is that his silence was doing the responding. The truth is in the silence. And if Pilate had been awake, he would have, I get it, sorry Jesus, let him go, and given him a professorship at the University of Galilee that he could have set up for him. If I'd have been Pilate, I would have said, okay, I've got a master here. No, we're not going to crucify him, and we're going to give him a teaching job. But unfortunately, Pilate wasn't, on that intellectual level. Okay, fast forward to more recent times. We come through Boethius, who was a great philosopher in the ancient Roman world. The Neoplatonic school, Porphyry and so on, he invented something called the tree of Porphyry. So things come in clusters of beingness. So this is a cup, right? It's of the species of things called cups. It's one example. Right now on the planet there's at least probably 10 million cups. I don't know, maybe more. And if you saw them all in like a tree form, the cup would be the first cup that was ever invented, probably when they invented clay in the Neolithic times, let's say 10,000 BC in some village in Turkey. The people sitting around the fire, at night, the clay made a cup shape in the morning, and they, oh, that's good, we can drink from that. They invented the cup. And so ever since there have been other cups coming. So logically, you can group things together, they're cups. And the same with everything. There's candles, there's lamps, pens, they all come with categories. So in Porphyry's logical tree, everything can be neatly placed somewhere on the tree. So you could put this on something, instruments which help write. Now, that's not just pens, it could be a paintbrush, it could be a spatula, it could be a kind of gun that fires paint out of a nozzle. So there's a whole, it could be a quill pen, like Shakespeare used. So that would be another step up the logical tree. So it's been a thing that intellectuals have been doing, is trying to group things and find out what variety of reality they belong to. We wouldn't say this is a living thing. So this wouldn't be in the group called animals. That's a whole different thing. It doesn't move about. Okay, that's just a little glimpse. I won't go on, but a little glimpse of what logical philosophy does. We could, if there was time, I'd explain the work of Wittgenstein, Frege, Schlick, and John Wisdom, and a man at Oxford called Austin, who argued that to do any real philosophy, you have to analyse the concepts down to their absolute core constituents. So if you look at the nature of truth, what is it? And you can look at examples of what is truth. Is it a thing that we do only in speech? No, it's something we also act. If you're dealing with somebody that can't speak and you say, raise your right hand if it's true that your mother was Egyptian. They raise the left one. Well, that means probably she wasn't, But so philosophers like to analyse reality into these different categories of things. And I think I think it was an exciting turn, but a false turn, when Bertrand Russell and Whitehead wrote a book called the Principia Mathematica, and they tried to analyse all thought into the same rigour as mathematics. They were asking, what is thought made of? Could we break it down into mathematical things? And if so, could we have like a language that explains thought in purely mathematical terms? And that is a kind of temptation to try and analyse thought into logical terms and invent a system for describing that mathematically. And so philosophers invented a whole language. Personally, I don't think that's the direction to go. I think thought is mercurial and will always defy any language that tries to explain it. And what I was inspired to do, because of my experience of studying that kind of philosophy, Wittgenstein said, the limits of my world are the limits of my language. If I can describe something and explain it, then I understand it, is what he's saying. Human reality is really, really complex, and the thought world that I inhabit, late 20th century kind of guy from British, European, Canadian background, I have certain things that I understand, and then there are things I don't understand. They're outside my remit entirely. I was listening to a lecture by a Canadian Indian last week called, he's a professor at the University in Calgary, in Alberta, where I used to live. And he was an advisor to a book on Blackfoot physics, the Blackfoot tribe of Canadian Indians around Alberta. They have their own cosmology and their own physics, which he was explaining and was written down by a friend of mine called David Peat. This indigenous way of looking at the world is very different. I mean, that's why I've studied the Druids. I think we have in the Celtic world an indigenous science. But this chap was saying how time is seen totally differently in the Blackfoot world. He was giving the American Indian words for time. Totally different to our way of thinking. And that's what inspired me to write my dictionary of philosophical terminology in all different languages, including American Indian. I think this is my contribution to analytical philosophy, is we should analyse the linguistic terms we use for things like time in all these different cultures, sit around and try and get some common agreement, And the word for peace is in them all. I think we have a duty as philosophers to use our knowledge of discernment, critical awareness, analysis, to analyse the differences so that we are no longer minded to kill each other in brutal ways. And that ties in with what I think physicists should be doing. So how do these two relate? There's the analytical philosophy tradition of 147, and there's the physics lot in 155, right? They're both very clever people in categories, right, in universities and all over the world. I think that what they should be doing is doing better physics and better philosophy so that they reach a greater agreement on an intercultural basis. Why can't physicists train in Chinese thought or Buddhist thought or Hindu thought or Blackfoot, a Canadian Indian or Druid, in also, as well as mainstream Western physics? We might have more humility. Instead of inventing atomic bombs to destroy huge cities with one blast of a megaton hydrogen bomb, we could use physics to invent non-polluting energy sources to help discover cars that don't pump out carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide and help global warming and stuff. We need physics that is life-affirming and that works to help medical doctors solve the big problems of the world instead of making them worse. So more philosophy and ethics in physics, and more sort of comparative global analytical thought for philosophers, I would say. Okay, that's That's my attempt to link them.
Super.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Okay. Round 2. Doop, doop, doom. Okay. 156, philosophy and chemistry.
Okay. Right.
And then 150, eco-philosophy.
Ah. Right, so we're still on the interrelations between the sciences and philosophy. It's very exciting. Okay, so we'll start with chemistry. I've always been interested in chemistry, but I wasn't that interested enough to want to do an A-level in it and study it for a degree. Although I found it fascinating. We had to learn the periodic table of the elements at Brighton Home and Sussex Grammar School, where I studied chemistry, and then do experiments in test tubes and put them in a Bunsen burner and boil this substance with that substance. And did it turn green? Yes. Okay. It was exciting up to a certain point, but and of course it's all tied in with atomic theory and physics, because the arguments of chemistry are that we know how substances are formed and how we can mix them and therefore create new syntheses, new substances. And that is interesting. There was a slight problem when one experiment we were doing led to a mass outbreak of chlorine gas in the classroom, and we all had to evacuate the classroom. That was the best chemistry lesson we had, because the teacher hadn't got his sums right. Again, it goes back to Democritus, and then it was taken up by Boyle in the British scientific Enlightenment, an Irish guy who really did some important work in chemistry. Lavoisier in France, who helped discover oxygen. This is exciting. Like, what are the gases that things are made of? Can we analyse them? What do they look like? Joseph Priestley helped with that, but it was Lavoisier that actually called it oxygen. And that fitted in with studies in biology, because all life depends on oxygen, and animals have to breathe, and how does that work in the cells? I mean, this is exciting, and also with medicine, because cells die if you don't get enough oxygen to them. If you stop breathing, that's it. Goodbye, Thomas. So Dalton was another great chemist who contributed to this. And of course Mendeleev, a great Russian chemist, who invented the periodic table of the chemical elements, which gave me the idea of doing the religious and philosophical table of elements, if you want. So hats off to Mendeleev, and it came to him partly in a dream, I understand. And it had been done a lot in the Islamic world. Great chemists like Ibn Khayyam, Al-Kindi, Al-Hazen, Al-Barini. We, historians of science, and I'm a historian of science, have gone into detail on the Islamic contributions to chemistry, which was a lot. And a lot of the words we use, like alcohol, they're from Arabic. And it was Islamic chemists that first synthesized these things. They were working at an advanced level of chemistry. And also it came from ancient Egyptian sources. So the first real chemists were in ancient Egypt. And the term chemistry comes from the word for Egypt. Al-Chem meant the black land and the black art of chemistry. But black was understood as sacred. It's holy, because the earth of Egypt is holy. And it's black, and the people were black, and therefore it's a holy colour. And so, and it was called alchemy for a long time. What we call chemistry began as alchemy. And in the Middle Ages, alchemists were people that had laboratories full of, means of boiling and synthesizing matter in different proportions and then studying what happened. And out of that came chemistry, effectively. In alchemy, they felt that matter was alive. It was somehow infused with God's nature. And that if you prayed whilst the experiment was going on, that might affect the experiment for the better. That idea went out of fashion. Now, no, none of that. We don't need to pray in the laboratory, just do the thing. I'm not sure that's not coming back a bit. In the work of the Scientific and Medical Network, there are advanced biologists and chemists who are now looking at the role of consciousness in science. And they're saying, no, consciousness is part of the equation somehow. I was giving an example of the wrong kind of consciousness can affect negatively your health and well-being. And that seems to be pretty much proved. And doctors will say, well, if you've got stress in your life, your heart will be in problem. That's just a fact. But it's much more subtle. If you're really depressed and can't see the meaning and purpose of life, then physically you'll probably be ill. So chemistry is really interesting. And there are different branches, organic and inorganic chemistry. It's used obviously in biology. It's used in many different branches and fields of knowledge and technology. What about the next one, eco-philosophy? So this is a branch of philosophy that I've been associated with for many years. Quite modern. Philosophers who are saying that we should look at nature and take into account the whole ecosphere. We don't exist in a vacuum. We should love this earth, treasure it, understand it, work with it, and not overload the system, not pollute it, not use up all the resources, find a way to live intelligently, in harmony with nature, and work with ecology. And one of the founders of eco-philosophy was a man called Henryk Skolimowski, who was a friend of mine, a great Polish philosopher who did actually start out as an analytical philosopher in Poland and Oxford, and then he branched out and became an eco-philosopher. I went to some of his courses and met him, and I think he's probably passed on now. He was quite elderly when I was a young student. He used to run courses in Greece in the summer. And there've been a variety of great eco-philosophers. And what they're saying is that life has a value and a meaning, and then it's by studying its interconnectivity that comes out. Nothing exists in a vacuum, isolated. If you isolate somebody and put them in a little jar and you don't let them get oxygen, they're going to die. We exist because the trees breathe out oxygen, and we in turn breathe out carbon dioxide that they can ingest. We exist in this ecological balance, and that's what these philosophers are looking at. There's a branch of eco-philosophy called deep ecology, which also looks at spirituality and consciousness. So that would say that when an American Indian goes to the woods and does a prayer for the trees, at some strange level we can't understand, the trees like that. They can actually pick up on the vibrations of that prayer, and that forest is more likely to flourish. And also that priest or that elder who's doing the prayer is going to be more healthful, because it's like a relationship. So prayer's part of that ecological exchange between living forms. When the monk in the abbey down the road does his prayers, the trees surrounding the monastery like it, and the little animals and the hares and whatever. When St. Francis used to pray, all the animals would come and sit around entranced. How does that work? I don't know, but it's a mystery. I'll finish this one with a little story. This is a true story. So years ago I lived in Wales, and I had a dear friend who I met. We went for a drink in a pub, and she told me a story, a true story. I have no reason to doubt her veracity. She was a spiritualist, and she used to go to spiritualist churches all over Wales, where a medium would do a performance. You know, how mediums work, they get a kind of channeling from beyond, someone that's passed away. And she was going to this particular medium who was giving a platform readings, they're called, in this church about 80 miles away. And in Wales, the lanes are very difficult. There's no great through roads, so it's difficult driving up and down hills. And at one point, the traffic really slowed down on this remote country road, and crawling along for like 10 minutes, and she thought, what's going on? It must be an accident or something. Finally went and got past the police who were directing the traffic, you know, into one lane. And she wound the window down and said to the policeman, "Why the delay, officer? What's been going on? I've been waiting 10 minutes, I'm dashing to a meeting in a church." And he said, "Sorry about that, madam. There was a bit of an accident here. A car went into a sheep. Poor thing, we had to put it by the side of the road, and it's you know, it's dying. It's not going to live." And so the traffic had to be, you know, cut down whilst we did that. And she understood, fine, okay, wound the window back up. And as she was driving on, she said a little prayer, being a spiritual person, for the sheep, you know, just like, just sort of instinctively, if you're a spiritual person, you'll say a prayer if someone dies. And she thought no more of it and went on. After about another 20 minutes, she got to the church and went in. She was a bit late, of course, went in and sat down at the back. And the medium was already on the platform getting people's grannies and uncles and, "I've got your grandfather here. Is anyone called Fred?" type of thing. Soon after she sat down, I'd only been there a few minutes, the medium finished what he'd been doing and said, "I don't know how to say this, but I've got a sheep here. Anyone recognise that?" And like everyone thought, he's gone crazy. I mean, it's not normal to get a sheep in a medium hearing. My friend put her hand up at the back and said very sheepishly, "Well, I think it might be something to do with me." And the medium said, "Okay, I've got this strange message. I don't know if this makes any sense to you, but this sheep is saying to you, thank you very much for that prayer. It really helped him orientate in the next world." And she was flabbergasted because she'd never ever heard a medium get an animal before. It's like I've been to mediumship things on spiritualist churches. I've never heard of that before. It's like it's very rare, I would say. And for her, it was absolutely convincing proof that the guy was genuine, because like there's no way he could have known that she just said a prayer for a dead sheep on the way there. So, you know, within deep ecology, that is explicable. Deep ecology provides a paradigm whereby all of life, animals, plants, trees, cells, we're all interconnected through consciousness. And prayer is our human duty to help facilitate that communication, if you want. Anyway, I love that story, and I believe it's 100% true, that story. But of course, science would dismiss that and say that's nonsense. You know, we're going to sack you if you say that in a formal, you know. But in religious studies, that is understandable. But what eco-philosophy is trying to do is trying to formulate a kind of way of explaining that interconnectedness. Why we should respect nature, animals, trees, rivers. I mean, now there's an attempt to make every river have its own parliament. Some friends of mine have created this project of let's have a parliament of rivers. So you go to the parliament of rivers as a representative of the Thames or the Nile,